Production of Being Well is made possible in part by Sarah Bush Lincoln Health System, supporting healthy lifestyles, eating a heart-healthy diet, staying active, managing stress, and regular checkups are ways of reducing your health risks. Proper health is important to all at Sarah Bush Lincoln Health System. Information available at sarahbush.org. Rediscover Paris. Our patient care and investments in medical technology show our ongoing commitment to the communities of East Central Illinois. Paris Community Hospital Family Medical Center.
HSHS St. Anthony's Memorial Hospital, delivering compassionate care close to home. From advanced surgical techniques and testing to convenient care for your family, we promise to make a healthy difference each and every day. St. Anthony's, together, we are better.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in for this special live edition of Being Well. I'm your host, Key-Ann Armstrong, and tonight we're talking about a heavy topic several people across the nation. That's teenage depression and suicide. And joining me this evening are Dr. Katie Hecksel with Sarah Bush Lincoln, as well as Dr. David Stoltz with Sarah Bush Lincoln as well. Katie is a child psychiatrist and David is a pediatrician. Thank you so much for joining me this evening.
You're welcome.
So we're talking about teenage depression and suicide this evening, and something that our partners on this program have shared with me is something called an Illinois Youth Survey. And among that survey, there were over 3,000 teenagers in a 7-county region here who were surveyed on what their top concern was. And their top concern among 8th graders was teenage depression and suicide. And so that's why we're talking about this tonight. Let's talk about what it is. What is teenage depression?
So teenage depression and depression in general is a period of 2 or more weeks in which a person experiences intense sadness, depressed mood, or a loss of interest or pleasure in things they previously enjoyed doing. Along with that, there are typically several symptoms that cause decreased functioning. So a change in sleep and appetite, decreased energy, decreased motivation, struggles with self-esteem, and in the most severe cases, thoughts about wanting to die or kill themselves.
Which is a very sad state to be in.
Definitely.
Is that how you would?
And one of the other things that I often see with this too is an underlying irritability, anger, a foul mood. They have a very short fuse. And many times people say, well, the child's having a bipolar disorder. They make a misdiagnosis because the symptom that they're seeing is that irritability.
So we're talking about depression and suicide. So if a teenager is depressed and they may have some of these different things that are leading toward their depression, when does somebody need to take notice of this is leading in a direction of suicide? How do you know?
Sure. I think the important thing backing up to depression is to note, I get a lot of questions from parents, aren't teenagers supposed to be sullen and hiding in their room all the time and constantly, hiding behind their computers, not wanting to talk to me. And there is some natural progression during the teenage years of wanting to separate from parents and figure out their own identities. So the most important thing as far as trying to figure out, is this depression in my child, is it a distinct difference from how the teenager or the adolescent is typically behaving. So usually a lot of these symptoms are occurring at the same time. It's a sudden change in the severity of it. It's not their typical child. And that's, when people should be concerned that it might be more than just, a typical teenager.
Right. Where do you draw the line of what's a normal behavior, a mood versus concern?
That is a next to impossible question to answer easily. Part of this has to do with a person's just underlying personality, but then, like what Katie said, is when you have this change, and it's rather noticeable. Sometimes adults and kids are very good at hiding depression. There's been a stigma about mental health in our society for decades upon decades, and it's still there.
Yes, it is. Now, speaking of decades upon decades, has depression and suicide been as prevalent as it is today, or are we just hearing about it and talking about it more?
I think it is becoming more prevalent in certain populations. I mean, I think we're in a society that's very fast-paced. There are a lot of teenagers and adolescents who are very heavily programmed in after-school activities. There's a lot of pressure for them to perform in school. Social media has brought a whole different dynamic into things where you can reach large amounts of people with small posts, and that's both for good and bad. I mean, we've seen cyberbullying take an impact on people's mental health, as well as people being able to seek help and support for various things such as depression through the media. I think a lot of the time the increased awareness of what depression is and starting to see a decreased stigma as far as acknowledging depression and people wanting to get help for their children or wanting to get help for themselves has helped people to become more aware of it and to talk about it more.
Yeah, I think that's a big key that we've shared among one another in preparation of this program is knowing how to talk about it. So where do you begin a conversation with your child about, are you depressed? Do you feel depressed? How do you even approach that conversation?
You can do it subtly. Have meals together. Try to have the evening meal. Try to make sure that the child is not isolated back in their rooms. The American Academy of Pediatrics does not recommend television in kids' rooms. It forces them to go out with the rest of the family and watch. Talk.
I think there are, this is both for depression and suicide. There's a lot of concern that talking about it, particularly with suicide, is going to worsen the issue or somehow lead your child to attempt suicide. The reality is, a lot of times when people are suffering with depression or suicidal thoughts, by asking them directly about it in a concerning way, saying, I'm really concerned about you. I've noticed some changes. I just, I kind of wonder, is something going on? Are you feeling like you might be depressed? That often opens a door for them to be able to talk about it. And a lot of times that's what they're wanting to do. I think being really non-judgmental, trying not to find solutions for them, trying to understand what their experience is, how you can be helpful from their perspective. In cases where the depression is very severe and people are having suicidal thoughts, making sure that you're not leaving the child alone and not trying to deal with it alone. So, making sure you're seeking out other support, ideally from mental health practitioners, but in the immediacy, other family members, other friends, people that can help you along this process. I think it's really important when you're dealing with children and teenagers to make sure that you don't promise confidentiality. I think it can be really dangerous to promise that you're not going to tell anyone, because the reality is their life is a lot more important than a secret. And in times where that is the case, a lot of times it happens between friends or between siblings. It's much better to break that trust and still have a live person to help than to keep a promise but not be able to help someone.
Right.
And I think the other thing too is to not have a mentality that this can't happen to your child. So depression crosses all gender, socioeconomic, religious, age barriers, different sexual orientations. There isn't a group in the United States that's not affected by depression or suicide, and that's okay. It's okay to get help.
And suicide is preventable.
It is preventable. There are 4 out of 5 completed suicides in which the person who killed themselves gave clear warning signs beforehand. So that's 80% of people that, if we had been able to recognize the warning signs and intervene, could have potentially prevented that suicide.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. What are some warning signs that we do need to pay attention to?
Sure. So if someone, regardless of whether they're depressed or not, so what we find is that depression is a risk factor in 60% of suicides in teens and adolescents. If you're noticing that people, regardless of whether they have a history of depression or not, start talking about wanting to die, wanting to commit suicide, starting to research ways to kill themselves online. There's a lot of access that children, all people have now via the internet, for better or worse. Getting together the means, so if someone is buying a firearm, if they're stockpiling pills, if they're talking about things being hopeless, not seeing a future, being incredibly agitated. A lot of times people will have an increase in substance use around that time and other ways that they're trying to cope to try to feel better in the immediacy. Talking about being a burden to others, wanting to seek revenge when we talk about people who are being bullied and sometimes commit suicide as a way to kind of get back at bullies. Also people who are preparing to say goodbye. So if someone has been very depressed and all of a sudden they're feeling very calm and happy, they're giving away belongings, they're very different than they've been for several weeks preceding, that can be a really significant warning sign.
Okay. How would you like to answer that question, Dr. Stoltz?
I would hardly have anything to add to that. I think the one thing is they often talk about it, and it should not be dismissed. In my career, I've had a couple of times where parents will come in and said, well, she's talked about killing herself, but we don't believe her. We think she's doing it for attention. And then they'll look to me, why don't you tell her not to do that and set her straight? Oh my goodness. Take a child seriously. Take an adult seriously when they're talking about what Dr. Hecksel has mentioned.
Yeah, and I think too, people look at suicidal people seeking attention as a negative thing. You know, I think if you reframe that as someone who is desperately wanting help and maybe not knowing how to reach out, and taking every suicide attempt seriously for a couple of reasons. There are people we know that have repeated suicide attempts and nearly chronic suicidal ideation. The problem is sometimes the suicide attempt that they want to be a cry for help ends up being successful in the sense that they actually do die from it, even though they may not have intended to do so in the first place. So, you know, that can be a significant risk. But yeah, I mean, taking it seriously, expressing concern, you know, if that's the way that they are framing the suffering they're having, maybe helping them to come up with different ways to explain their pain if they aren't in fact suicidal. But it's much better to pay attention to someone saying they're suicidal and be wrong and see that, you know, maybe there was a big attention component to it than to, you know, downplay it and have it be someone dying.
Right, yeah. So taking time is a problem these days. It seems like everybody's busy and running, and the kids are in activities and stimulated all over the place. You can't disconnect. Does that attribute at all to any of the teen depression that's going on these days?
It certainly can. Many people require some downtime or time to relax. And you have some high-achieving kids that are in multiple sports, they're in multiple clubs, they never have a chance just to sit and do nothing. Then you also have some kids that, how should I say this, they're in so many things they never see the light of day. They are not able to go out and have fun on their own. Mm-hmm. Their time is consumed, and there's this underlying pressure to succeed at everything they do.
Feeling like they need to be perfect.
Yes.
And so when they're not perfect, then they feel bad about that. And then it can lead into depression and one thing after another. But they've got to be exhausted as well. So how does that play in?
Well, I know they've looked at people who have been sleep deprived, and it's used as a form of torture in some cases. And, you know, we're all impaired if you're sleep deprived enough. And then I think if you add on top of being sleep deprived all of these other stresses, either in families or at school or with multiple extracurriculars, it really eats away at somebody's resilience and ability to cope with even some small stressors where they start to feel really big and difficult to overcome.
Are teens the only ones that are at risk, or does it start earlier and then when it gets up to the teen years, you're starting to really notice this type of thing? Like, how soon can you really take notice that depression is a problem?
Go ahead.
No, you can see depression or stress, anxiety in preschoolers. So you may have a preschooler whose grandmother has died, and you can tell that they are depressed because grandma's not there. Or they have someone who becomes horribly ill. They don't realize that this person is going to get better, but then when one of their friends or a parent or a grandparent becomes ill, they are distraught. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned earlier, one time it was thought that little kids, grade school kids, were not supposed to have anxiety disorders or depression, and that has been shown not to be true for decades.
Right. So what can you do about that as a parent? Talk to them? Should you seek counseling? Should you take them to the doctor? What's the first step?
I think conversation is the first step, really opening it up. There are a lot of good resources, depending on the child's age, workbooks that focus on depression and sadness, smaller books that talk about feelings, including depression and anxiety. I think, giving children the vocabulary to talk about it is really important. Acknowledging that children, depending on their developmental stage, sometimes communicate a lot better through other means such as drawing or play, and so trying to get cues when you're hopefully spending time with them in those arenas. If you are concerned that your child might be depressed, a lot of times the first step is going to a primary care provider or talking to a counseling center. The reality, particularly in this rural area, is that there are limited resources in mental health, and we're seeing that around the country for the most part. And so, going into your primary care doctor and saying, I'm really concerned about my kid, this is what's been going on, or calling a local counseling center and saying, hey, my child is doing this, does it seem like that would be an appropriate, reason to come in and talk to you? And they can be really helpful with other resources if it isn't the appropriate, place.
Okay. Talking about local resources, on the Sarah Bush Lincoln website, there is a cord link that has lots of resources. If anyone's looking for more information, you can visit that website as well. And I want to go back to something that you mentioned just a second ago about when you do go to the doctor, you talk to him and say, or her, and say, these are the things that are going on with my child. I don't think that would be so easy for a parent, because I think a lot of times they would feel guilty, like, what did I do? Have I missed something? What have I done here? And kind of withdraw, but you really need to talk about these things and really express these things. So how can you help parents who are trying to get to that point, to get to the doctor and feel like it's okay to talk?
Sure.
Well, one thing that I often bring up is I suffer from depression myself. And I often tell kids, especially teenagers, if you're happy and giddy all the time, never experiencing any sadness, you're weird. This is the one thing, is that people have emotional ups and downs. Normal people will have depression sometime in their life, and I put normal in quotes because a lot of people would not consider me normal, but it's out there, it's prevalent, and people with depression, suicidal ideation, anxiety disorders do not walk around with it stenciled on their forehead. It's very common.
Right.
I think when you're talking about parents, we all, as parents, feel guilty about things. Our child falls off the playground equipment and we think, what if we had been 2 steps closer? Mm-hmm. I think it's natural for parents to want their kids to be healthy and happy. And when that's not happening, to feel like there should be something that they can do to make that better. So I guess I would encourage parents to take that guilty feeling and activate it, do something about it to try to help your child. This is nothing that you did to your child. There are family factors that can make depression more likely. A lot of times if there's a lot of conflict in the family or some struggles with cohesion or children feeling alienated, they can be more likely to be depressed. But using, that guilt, if that is going on in your family, to try to improve the family unit and to function better as a family is much more effective than taking the guilt and not doing anything with it.
Okay. All right. What about mental illness? How does that play into depression and or suicide? Is it hereditary? what can you tell me about mental illness and how it plays into the topics we're discussing?
I often refer to it as a perfect storm. So there are some genetic components to most mental illnesses, but it's not perfect. It's not like the diseases where, you know, a mom has 50% likelihood of passing it on. You know, you're talking about very small genes. So while you might have a slightly increased risk for depression if you have an immediate family member who suffers from it, it's not one-to-one, it's not 100% guaranteed. So usually it's someone who has a predisposed biological risk, genetic risk, who then is under a lot of different stress or is experiencing different hormonal changes around adolescence, where the depression first shows up. So it's often multifactorial.
Okay.
And every once in a while you come across the resilient child that you would think they should have depression. And they just go through life determined. And of course, these are the people that you read about in Reader's Digest. They're held up as this icon you're supposed to emulate, but most of us couldn't do that. Or I know I couldn't.
Right. What are some of the treatment options for teens who are suffering from depression?
So they've looked at people with mild and moderate depression, and they've found pretty similar rates of effectiveness between medication, counseling, and a combination of them. For severe depression, so we're talking about people where their functioning is significantly impaired because of the depression, or they're at imminent risk for suicide. Those people, if it's not so severe that they're immediately hospitalized, do best with a combination of medicine plus therapy, psychotherapy, or counseling.
Okay. And when you say therapy or counseling, are they the same thing? Because, I mean, there's all these different words that people use,
Sure.
and then there's psychiatrists such as yourself, psychologists, you know, so how do parents know who to seek out first?
Sure. As a psychiatrist, I went to medical school and completed a residency and then a fellowship, so 5 years after medical school training. So I primarily manage diagnoses, coordinating care with therapists or any kind of testing that needs to be done, and managing medications or, you know, other healthcare type things that are impacting someone's mood. Psychiatrists can do counseling or psychotherapy a lot of times in areas such as this, where I'm the only one for several counties. I rely on counselors to do a lot of the counseling. So counseling and psychotherapy, when I'm talking about it, I'm using it interchangeably. So they're generally in this area masters or doctoral level trained individuals who meet with children, with families, with adults, and talk. It's typically a 1 hour session, often for a period of 6 months, give or take, where they're focusing on ways to deal with the mood, how to cope with the things that people are experiencing that are contributing to the depressed mood, how to prevent relapses if they are feeling better.
Okay.
So just improving resilience and coping.
All right. Now, a teen would need to see a pediatrician before they were referred to you, correct?
In our system, yes.
Okay. All right. So, Dr. Stoltz, if parents brought their teen to you and told you what was going on, how would walk a parent through what would take place?
Well, one of the things is I would do a history, and part of that is, for example, I copied off teen depression, and it lists the things I would need to ask about. Since I don't do this every day like Katie does, I would go down the list, see if they met the criteria. I would discuss the treatment options. You have some kids that have depression and they do not want to go to a counselor. But I usually push counseling because I will say that it is as effective as medication, and often the combination of counseling and medication works better. But you go over the treatment options, whether we can refer the person to a counselor at Sarah Bush Lincoln or through the county health department. Then I will go over the medications and point out that many of the medications are very similar. And what we do, or the way I start, is start out with one of the medications from the SSRI class, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and try that. go up on the dose, see if it's effective. If it doesn't work, I may try another. If things get worse or there's no improvement, I refer to a wonderful child psychiatrist.
Okay. We do have a call from Matt Toon, and either of you can answer this, but it may be geared more to you with what you were just talking about, but feel free to chime in. In your opinion, when is the right time to introduce medication for a teen who is depressed? And when they begin taking that medication, will they take it forever?
When is the right time depends on how the teen is feeling. If they are responding well to counseling, we don't need to consider it. If they refuse counseling, then we would go with the medication. If they're in counseling, seem to be getting worse, or if it's not that effective, we would start.
Okay.
Then when it comes to the length of the medication, sometimes it may be for 3 to 6 months, and then it depends on how they are doing. A person does not need to be on an antidepressant for the rest of their life.
Production of Being Well is made possible in part by
HSHS St. Anthony's Memorial Hospital, delivering compassionate care close to home. From advanced surgical techniques and testing to convenient care for your family, we promise to make a healthy difference each and every day. St. Anthony's, together, we are better.
Sarah Bush Lincoln Health System, supporting healthy lifestyles, eating a heart-healthy diet, staying active, managing stress, and regular checkups are ways of reducing your health risks. Proper health is important to all at Sarah Bush Lincoln Health System. Information available at sarahbush.org.
Rediscover Paris.
Our patient care and investments in medical technology show our ongoing commitment to the communities of East Central Illinois. Paris Community Hospital Family Medical Center.